Hi everyone, welcome. I'm Amy Curtai. I'm the Acting Director of the Digital Academy and Community Engagement here at the Exchange Lab. Welcome to our very first edition of the Digital Academy Bytes. We're coming to you from the Exchange Lab here in beautiful Victoria, British Columbia. And I'm privileged to be joining from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen people, known as the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. The BB8s are an 8-part educational series that we're really seeking to illuminate topics related to digital, data, and emerging methodologies, and just other areas of technological interest. And I'm very pleased to be joined with our special guest today, Jillian Carruthers. Welcome. Jill is the Executive Director of Service Transformation at the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy. And Jill's going to be speaking with us today about digital age leadership and really sharing her insights on being an effective public servant in this digital era. So we're really happy to have you joining us today. In terms of formatting for the event, we're going to be using Slido, so I really encourage you to put your questions or comments into the chat there. We're going to be monitoring that. And once Jill has a chance to go through her presentation, we'll be talking about the questions that you popped in and just doing a bit of Q&A. So over to you, Jill.
Awesome, thanks Amy. I'm excited to be here, and this is my favorite topic, which when I say digital age leadership or governance to people is my favorite topic, they usually panic and or think I'm crazy, which who knows, might be true. Pleased to be joining you today, everyone, and I'm going to walk through a bit of a deck here, focused first on digital age leadership and really looking at how we shift the expectations and create some conditions for success and where we're going. First off, my name is Jillian Carruthers, as Amy mentioned here, Executive Director of Service Transformation. The first thing you're probably thinking is that sounds made up. And that's because it might be. But there is actually some valid reason why service transformation is a real thing. So fundamentally, we're looking to support businesses, and we're looking to not just support businesses in digital transformation, but start looking at how are we taking those bigger, more complex policy, process, organizational challenges and putting them together in a holistic solution for better services. So ultimately, it's not conflating it with digital transformation. It's a necessary part of what we're doing, but it's a little bit bigger than just that. And we're going to cover a few of those pieces. Ultimately, this starts with the quote that you see here. This is all about accessible and quick services. In government, we're really looking for access to some sort of services, which ultimately is how we build trust. So if we're not getting good services, or we're not, getting easy where we are, having services meet where we are, ultimately what's happening is we don't have trust in government to do those big, hard, crunchy things. And if we don't have trust in our government to do those hard, crunchy things, how are we going to trust them to do the day-to-day things? And how are we going to trust our leaders to do anything beyond those basics? So note here on this quote that accessible isn't just about an accessible digital service. This is about meeting people where they are. So this is about what channels make sense for you, whether it's analog, whether it's in a digital format, whether it's just breaking down the service into ways that work. So this has always challenged public services across the world, and we continue to explore how we can do that better. So how do we get here? This is my favorite, because if you look at this, it's classic. You sit in a room, and we all sit with our leadership, and we go, problem A must go to problem B, and we can solve it, and everything's perfect. It's not that simple. We've had decades and decades and decades of buildup of policy, and process, and bureaucracy that layers together in this incredible complexity, and we're somehow expecting ourselves to be able to untangle that in a very simple A to B. So this graphic really hits it. You walk out the room and you go, because it's not that simple thing you drew on the whiteboard. So ultimately, what we're trying to do is look at those complex organizational pieces, simplify, pull them out, and start teasing at strategies to make them A to B, even though we know it's not going to solve the whole problem. To compound it, I'll say one more thing here is, we do a horrible job in government of shutting down services. When we get that boulder rolling downhill and we've sold it to 5 executives over 3 years, it's a really hard time to say, that's not the right move anymore. So we layer and layer. So what do we hope to accomplish? Ultimately, service transformation is looking at that legislative, service, and policy wraparound to create that shift in what we're actually doing. It's looking at that entire picture. ultimately, it's turning that picture around to building the right service, not just the service that already exists with some modernized features. So that's my long-winded introduction of service transformation, because I think it sets the frame for where we're going to go today. So 3 things today that we're going to cover off. First, digital age leadership, aka embedding the leadership competencies that we need to have now to do our jobs because we live in a digital age. Check. Governance, again, favorite topic, swear word, you lose people, they eye roll here. Create the air cover that you need to succeed. So we're going to talk about governance. Third, build trust through delivery now and later. So this is iterating, but it's also thinking about the long picture. So we'll talk a little bit about preparing the product, whatever that is, policy, service, digital product, doesn't matter. Prepare the product and the organization, because without the organization, you're not going to be successful. So my disclaimer, we're going to do talking head, or I'm going to do talking head here for 20-ish minutes. And then we'll have lots of time to ask questions. So throw your questions into Slido. However you want to engage through Slido, please do. Ask lots of questions, ask hard questions, and I'm happy to share stories. I've taken some of the expert pieces in here. It's all referenced, and so I will share these slides out after so you can see where the references came from, some of which actually from Amy's research. Okay, start with number 1. This is all going to be pretty rapid fire here, but embedding the competencies we all need. Deliberately saying it's a required field, because how many times have you heard this? A few times, I imagine. What about this one? From your colleague, your executive? Pretty classic. So this is from Martha Lane Fox, who is in our UK, former public servant, entrepreneur. Just as it would not be accepted for a minister to not understand how her department budget works, it is not acceptable for her to not understand how technology affects her brief. We live in an era where it is no longer acceptable for us to just say, we don't understand technology, or it's not part of what I know. It has to be embedded in what we are doing every day. So this is how we feel, whether it's your leadership, whether you are leadership, or whether it's the people and colleagues around you. We're asking people that have this non-technical background to make decisions about data and technology on a regular basis. It's just where we are. So let's reframe this whole idea that digital era competencies or technologies are for technologists or for people with technology training. Let's look at this definition. So we're talking about Tom Loosemore here from UK again, couple UK references in here throughout. Ultimately, it's looking at that culture, that practice, that process. It's that mindset. The technology is a part of it, but it's embedding this mindset that we need to not just build apps and put things in front of people. We need to think about how we're delivering a service end to end and all the pieces through the policy development to the thing or widget you are delivering to the person, regardless of how technology plays in. Another one, this is actually from Amy's research, so full credit given. Random participant, I believe. Digital leadership is reimagining what could be given, or what could be given existing and emerging capabilities. And then the key part here is it's inspiring, leading, initiating, and influencing that change. So again, you do not need to be a technologist to be able to do this. You just need to be engaged and actively participating and willing to go out and make a change. So specifically, talking about a digital age public leader, I could spend, and I have spent 20, 30, 40 minutes going through each of these competencies, but I'll leave that to you in your research or your questions. This 8, and I know it's going to be hard to read these, so again, you'll get these slides, don't try to read every word on this, and this is coming directly from the Teaching in the Public Service and the Digital Age curriculum, which is an open curriculum that, again, the link is in this place as well. Ultimately, what we're looking at is if you read through these, when we get through them, there's ultimately not a lot in there that you probably don't already do. There's a couple highlights around putting users at the center, using users to define what you're doing in the service that you're creating, using really good data and metrics to drive that. And we're going to talk about that a bit in governance as well. Okay, most importantly here, it is okay not to know. So we often have this culture, particularly in government, where we feel as though we have to be the experts in the room and we have to show up, whether we're a scientist, I'm working in the natural resource ministries, whether you're a scientist and you're showing up as a PhD and the technology is a bit baffling or the potential service you're delivering doesn't make any sense. It's okay not to know. Part of this and part of these competencies is really being thoughtful about how you're recognizing what you know, what you don't know, and how you're going to find out. So that's a key piece. The best thing we can do is to reach out and do research with the people that are using our service. No matter how uncertain we are, reaching out, having conversations, implementing that fundamental design. And I know Kevin Eamon, my director in strategic design in service transformation branch, is probably nodding his head vehemently right now, because that foundational design component is so often missed and so incredibly important from all different levels. Okay. Finally, on this little phrase. So ultimately, this takes leadership. So as much as you can have great technologists in the room and you can have awesome teams who are able to do, it really takes good leadership to start driving the value between government and citizens. And so your takeaway from this section is to go and look at those competencies and start identifying where you have areas that you could potentially grow, or where you have things that maybe you can grow your leaders or grow your staff, depending on where you sit in the organization. Shifting gears. Okay, create the air cover we need to succeed. This is all about trust. That's not a shocker, I don't think. No one is concerned about that being a thing. But navigating this complexity really requires that trust and building trust through what I would say is iterative and consistent delivery. So being incredibly clear about how and what you're doing, communicating openly with your executive, and we'll talk about a couple of those pieces. But we learn over and over again, and this is straight experience from service transformation in the last year, is if we don't have the ability to have open and clear communication with our staff, our executive, our peers and colleagues about what we're doing, and we don't trust each other to be able to deliver on the pieces that we have, we will 100% fail. Implementing novel processes absolutely requires a layer of trust, and that takes time. So don't think that there's a short answer to this. This is a long game, and it's important that you put that front and center before you even dive into how do I create the perfect steering committee. With that, what is the purpose of a steering committee, you might ask? Well, I did some Googling to try and help you out. And I found these two lovely definitions. A steering committee provides support, guidance, and oversight of a progress process, I think is what that should say. Steering committees are advisory bodies made up of senior stakeholders or experts that provide guidance, ... So note the two words that are highlighted in there, which are guidance. Okay? Steering committees do not equal consensus. So one of the things that we think of when we think of building air cover is we got to nail the governance model. We got to nail the governance model. But we don't actually really think about the definition of governance or steering committee and what it actually means. Instead, we think throwing a steering committee at the problem solves the problem. That's going to give me my air cover because I have a steering committee. Instead, we end up making our steering committees into consensus committees, and we never get anything done. So I'm actually not arguing that steering committees are bad. I'm actually saying we don't implement them properly in government. And if we were implementing them properly in government, we would probably have great governance. So steering committees are a part of governance. So next natural question, what is governance? Again, let's go to an ISO definition this time. Governance is for senior management to gain and give assurance that the investment generates value, okay, to the business and reduce the risk of bad outcomes. Okay, so governance doesn't always equal steering committees, or it doesn't only equal steering committees. What we have to do is put in place processes that get us to this place, where we actually have the ability to give assurance that an investment generates value and reduces the risk of bad outcomes. So what it means is that governance can be anything that supports the definition. So I challenge you to stop thinking of governance as a steering committee or as a group of a bunch of EDs or ADMs or whatever it happens to be, because that's not good governance. You can have a horrible governance and a rock solid working group, steering committee, executive decision co, and a deputy that's engaged. So challenge what you're thinking when you're setting up is the first piece out of this. So governance can be your air cover, is the summary of this. It's not a bad word. It's actually a good thing. It's your air cover. So I'm going to go back to GDS, Government Digital, or UK, Digital Services. There's 3 things in here we're going to talk about. They talk about 6, but there's 3 that I'm going to highlight for you as being what I think are the most important pieces to establishing. This is particular to agile service delivery, but I think it's more good, streamlined government for iterative delivery of service. Don't necessarily pin it solely on agile. So these 3. How many of you feel this way? Okay, so that's pretty common. So decisions, when they're needed at the right level at the last responsible moment. So a couple pieces in here to really think about. Delegate the authority or get delegation from above. Real delegation. Not the fake delegation of like, oh, you're in charge, but send me all the briefs and I'll sign off. Real delegation. So this is a thing you have to fight for. So if you are in the working, like doing level, you have to advocate for why. It goes back to the trust pin that we started at the very beginning. You have to advocate for why you are capable, competent, and willing to accept that delegated authority. So lots of things you can do there. Side topic. Decision making is evidence-based and user-centric. So if you have evidence to back what you are doing, why wouldn't they delegate authority to you? Decisions are made at the last reasonable moment. And I actually put in here, cough, cough, not every 2 weeks when you have a meeting. Mm-hmm. So if you need to go meet with someone to make a decision and you have to hold because the decision was needed on Monday, but your next meeting isn't until the following Thursday, how is that effective? How are you helping drive value? How are you mitigating the risk of bad outcomes? It's not good governance. So create spaces and opportunities where you can get decisions outside of scheduled times and meetings. Again, shocking, I know, all very possible, and you don't have to do this all at once. So ultimately, this is continuous improvement, this is iterative. The last bullet point is really just to hammer home the fact that you can do this a piece at a time. You don't have to throw this on your exec's plate today. Okay, how about this one? Executive is always asking so many questions, we can never get to the work. I think I hear this 3 times a week. And rightfully so. They're doing good governance, right? They're trying to make sure you're achieving value and they're trying to understand that you're not causing risk or exposing us to any necessary harms. Makes sense. So make it easy for them. Let them go see for themselves the things that they need to see in order to be confident that you don't need that level of oversight. You don't need to write a briefing note for everything that you're doing. So the first bullet here, demos not memos, or demos and memos, because I think they actually make sense in both. There's arguments for both. But thinking about how do we show our executive what we're doing in a timely, easy, and efficient way? How do we fold them into our cadence of work so that we're not disrupting the team? How do we give them easy and open access to real visual metrics that allow them to understand how well we're doing? Lots of opportunities. And most importantly, look for those opportunities to expose what you're doing to executive without creating unnecessary burden for you. And this will tie into the very last point here. How can I deliver when I spend all my time filling out reports and writing briefing notes? Also something I hear on a regular basis, and very valid. So only do it if it adds value. And this is where everyone goes, okay, Jill, that's fine for you to say. But I can't say that to my manager, my director. There's just no way. I can't. I would say you can, but you can say it in a thoughtful way. You can say, what is the purpose? I'm just trying to understand. What is the purpose for me writing this note right now? I'm understanding that we're trying to accomplish this, and we have a duty to document our decisions. I totally understand that. But help me understand why we're doing this level of delivery. So you can start by that. You can also make sure that whatever you're doing has really clear goals and a vision, because when people have ambiguity, they will write a story. And in that story, your executive will ask for more clarification, which often translates into briefing notes, PowerPoints, whatever. Certainly not demos, mostly memos. Last piece is value quality. So it doesn't mean you have to go fast with your time or with your team. It does mean you have to protect your team sometimes from your executive so that they can do the work that they need to do. Or if you're in the team, ask your leaders to protect you so that you can do the work that you need to do. Again, you got to be able to communicate that clear vision, or they have no reason to support or drive. All right. This is good. Okay. Build trust through delivery. Now and later. This is the short piece, but I think this is probably the most important piece as we start to break down how we actually shift the organization. So first and foremost, we have to create conditions for success. And complex organizational change, we can't just run at it. We cannot just go and expect people to change and then, everything's going to be tickety-boo. It won't be, because it's hard. So it's really hard to define, but we need to create opportunities for people to learn. So say taking digital age leadership courses through Digital Academy, learning and exploring new ways of thinking or doing things, building that competency. And part of this is leveraging what you just learned about building air cover, because you have to build air cover to be able to have the space to go and get ready with your organization. So ultimately, we want to learn by doing, but it creates that sort of, tolerance for mistakes. As an organization, we have to make sure that we're putting absolute focus on, are we ready to do the things that we're doing and not just jumping in to those spaces. And again, lots of key factors that we could dive into on those pieces. So this is a great quote, again, UK. Digital transformation is about building a new type of organization around internet era principles, not adding technical complexity to try and fix analog organizations. So again, red flag for you is if you start to see people just throwing technology at a problem and not thinking about the whole piece, the whole approach, how it fits in. You're typically just throwing technology at organizational debt, not the right approach or solution. So that's where we get to do it now and do it later. And this might be familiar to some of you, because this is actually Pia Andrews' Eye of Sauron, if you believe it, for her planning and executing project management. So she calls it provide fast value and long value. And so ultimately what you're looking in the do it now is find something that you can build that trust and confidence with. Pick a small release of whatever it is. Throw a draft policy at people and see how they react and get some feedback from people that are integrating with that policy. Start to build the momentum, because the momentum becomes, again, that trust builder. So the momentum will build your trust, it will build your air cover, and it will also allow you to then have more space later so that you can do the long part, which is the hard part. So this is where we often fail. We come in and we solve the problem by either doing something super quick and iterating it, and we're doing a great job, we use agile, we do all the things, but we don't think about the organization and the change that's required. So again, you go back to that state of readiness. That state of readiness is so incredibly important. I can deliver fast value for you now without that state of readiness, and when I leave, it's gone. Guaranteed it goes with me. So thinking about how you can actually move forward with those broader fundamental changes. So JP Fournier's doing Bytes next month, April 14th. Mm-hmm. He's going to go through funding and finance. That's one of those big organizational things. So you can't just shy away from the procurements, the HRs, the finance, maybe the readiness of your executive to accept new change, all those things, and just focus on your own thing, your own product. So do it now, but do not forget that it is also your responsibility, regardless of level, to also do it later. So always continually think about, how am I situating myself in the delivery today, walking back, and delivering also for what's going to happen tomorrow and for the colleagues that will come behind me. It sounds very like mother hen-ish, but it's a reality. Okay. that is all three things. So the recap here is embed the competencies that you need to lead today. So go read those 8 pieces, understand what they mean, find some gaps for yourself, and that is your homework, your 15-minute homework, because it's always about homework. Schedule it in your calendar today. You have the rest of the week to get it done. Create air cover you need to succeed. So look for those opportunities where you can challenge maybe things that aren't adding value and create space for you to do things that do add value. Look for those opportunities to build trust and momentum through building something or iterating on something relatively quickly. And same thing, build that trust continuously through delivering something now, but don't forget about the organizational needs long term, or it's going to fall apart when you leave. That's the formal piece, Amy. That was a lot of me talking. And I do have to give it one quick shout out to our team. So Kevin Even, Director of Strategic Design, Sam Tereni, who is our Project Administrator, and Harry Olson, who's our Senior Experience Designer, all contributing crazily across the Ministry of Environment. And we do post on Medium. So env.servicetransformation.medium.com, we post week notes, Kevin and I do. So if you ever want to follow along with the journey or the things that we're doing, that's a good place to do it.
And I love that you've been posting those because it's such a great way to show the great work that's happening, but also like encouraging others to work in the open and say like, here's what we're doing. Maybe there's something that would connect with you, or like, hey, we're doing that too. Like, let's get together and make sure that there's some cross-pollination happening.
And it's crazy that you say it because there's been so many times where we've had someone reach out based on something we put in our week notes. And we've created connections and synergies. We've also been able to reuse things throughout the public sector that we didn't even know were happening.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. There was so much to unpack there. We've got some questions coming in. Yeah, thank you for your insights there. We had one really interesting quote that came in that says, if you're the smartest person in the room, you might not be in the right room. And it's so true that it's like, we have to have this level of humility, but also be able to challenge and push things where it makes sense, right?
100%.
Yeah. So one of the great questions that's come through that I want to kind of pick apart here is, the comparison of public versus private. So in private sector, the thing that unites tech and non-tech is this, drive to increase revenue. So we see this, bottom dollar kind of focus. Does our lack of singular metric impact our ability to assess faults? So, I'm curious on your thoughts on that, and how do we, if we're not just money driven, how do we kind of assess some of these faults that we get?
Well, I think it's because we're not money driven, it just means we have to work a tiny bit harder to define what metrics are key and important. So I don't think it's actually a detriment. I think rightly so, it's more complex. It makes it a bit more challenging because you do have to work a little bit differently. It makes it harder to compare apples, oranges. I mean, my time working in the digital investment office taught us that more than anything. You cannot compare a project in the social sector to a project in advanced education to a project in the natural resource ministries and kind of go, well, you must all have the same metrics because it's completely different. So I would say, though, it comes back to that, and one of the competencies that floats in here is that data piece. It's defining the data and metrics that you are going to use for your particular service and product that aligns to your goals, that resonate with your executive. So, I was working in mines for quite a long time, looking at what's our speed of getting back to proponents and ensuring that we're communicating quickly. How quickly are we processing certain permit types that should be relatively simple? Those types of things become more important than just an ROI.
Yeah. And making sure that in the process of that, we're actually meeting the user needs. So it's not just some 100%. Metric that we're throwing out there. It's is this actually serving somebody or serving a purpose?
Well, and that's a great point, is that, we can process permits faster in any frame. So permits are all across government. We process permits faster, but are we doing our due diligence? Are we, working appropriately as a team in order to make sure that the proponent has a good experience as they go through the process? Are we actually providing the proper level of oversight, or are we even writing things that are enforceable, period?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, 100%. So we have this really interesting other question, and I really like it because, I think one of the important things is like this whole idea of insurgency and pushing the boundaries and like, how do you do that in an appropriate way, especially when you're not in a position of leadership, right? Where it's like, how can we do this in a non-career limiting way? But we have a comment here. When I challenge the status quo with the business, people say, oh, we've done it this way and it works, or like, oh, we can't do it that way. So how do we prepare people to think differently in this digital age? Like, how can we like create the conditions for people to start challenging those assumptions?
That's a really good question. And again, I think it's really situational on where you are, which I know is not a great answer, but in general, I think there's ways to enable people to go down the pathway themselves to start asking them the right questions. So if you're saying we've done that before, okay, yeah, totally. Tell me about when you did it. And getting them to start tell the story. So who did you talk to when you did that? And again, this comes back to driving everything from who's using the service, and that user-based research or that person-based, human-centered design, person-based research is there an avenue for you to be empathetic to their reality? They've gone through this 3, 4, maybe 5 times, and they're like, you're just another person flying in with some great ideas, and I'm done. Yeah. I don't want to hear it. So is there a way or an avenue or an opportunity for you to connect them to the potential problem? Is there a way to define? We don't do well at defining problems. This is another big rant. We don't do well in the public service at defining problems. We do well at assuming we've defined the problem and solving the problem that didn't exist or may not be the right problem. So starting to really understand their problem, and again, it's like, okay, well, what? Okay, so I know you've done it before, but tell me a bit more about what happened the last time you tried to do it differently. One of the things, and I had a deep conversation with someone about this yesterday, it's top of mind, that really comes in is we talked about that momentum of the public service, right? We've sold these ideas and they're going downhill and they're doing it like it's a boulder running downhill, and now we're trying to say it's a bad idea. This happens a lot in our current age because technology is changing so quickly, right? So just because you tried it 2 years ago, it might not be the right thing. And I won't use a specific example to not get pokey, but there are situations where we built something that made sense to build, and then now it's a market-based product that we should just be sourcing and focusing on our inputs and our efforts and our energies to create good content, not the technology. So I think some of it is situationally, it might not have fit 2 years ago. You can't outright say that to someone, or they're just going to tell you to go away. Yeah. But what you can do is start asking those questions, working down the path. And the thing is, this doesn't take time, and no one likes anyone who comes in hot and says, I'm going to do your business better than you, and we're just going to try that new thing again.
And I think it can be a bit intimidating or like, a bit jarring in an environment that's maybe traditionally a little more risk adverse, right? Like we've tried this, maybe we got burned. And there's an interesting comment or question that came in, like, do you have any tips for a very risk adverse environment where execs are looking for a lot of these updates and documents because we have been burned before, or we tried this once and it didn't work? So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's 2 things that jump out. One is understand the why. So do understand the burn. Like if you got burned because you got audited on the thing that you didn't have and you're being asked to create that thing, maybe you need to create it. That might be a thing to not push. The second thing that comes in is, again, that fast value piece. Are there opportunities that you can use to build momentum? So instead of writing the briefing note that might be 2-3 pages and takes you 6 or 8 hours to do, or maybe more, is there an opportunity for you to do a 5-minute verbal brief at exec? Can you go in and just show them the thing and say what you're doing? Can you get 3 minutes on a regular meeting that they have to provide that update versus writing it down? You still have your duty to document, and again, there's other reasons why we document things that are perfectly valid. So that's the understand the why piece. But I think there's always opportunity to shift the way you're doing something. So in that risk-adverse environment, the biggest thing I would say is just don't accept that as fact. You don't have to be a jerk about it, but don't accept it as fact. Understand the reasons why it was created and start thinking if there's other ways to solve the problem.
I think especially too when you're working with processes that have been long established and are very ingrained, it can be hard, right? Like, and understanding why are they there? What purpose are they serving is really important.
Yeah, and I think like even the third piece emerging that is like phone a friend.
Yeah.
Like, we're often all working in very similar environments, and if you're facing it, chances are good someone else is facing it too. So you might be able to go find someone in a parallel situation who's tried something different, or a parallel or above situation who can call your leadership and say, hey, this thing's worked really well for us. Have you ever thought about that? So there's ways you can work around. Like, phone a friend is always a great option.
Yeah, great point. It's something that, like, we use our network, but maybe not to the full extent that we should. So there's another comment kind of related to risk-adverse processes and stuff. And how do we as individuals manage risk-adverse processes or approvals in systems, especially when you're not directly connected to these areas? So things like legal or privacy reviews, where it's like you don't maybe have a lot of space to influence. So any tips on, like, how do you operate in an environment like that where you're still trying to move things forward but trying to be respectful of, staying in our lanes?
Yeah, that's a tough one, because there are valid processes for these things that oftentimes we don't. That is very much the fast value, long value.
Mm-hmm.
So what I would say is sometimes you're just hooped, but a lot of times you can learn the rules really, really well and play with them. So procurement is a really good example of this. If you know procurement inside and out, there's fast ways to do things. And there's absolutely correct, by the book, core policy approved ways to do things fast. So the most important things on some of those hard pieces, privacy, security, finance, HR, I always say that the things that are going to get you fired are probably those things. Procurement, finance, HR, policies flows in there, probably not, maybe not going to get you fired, but those big things, if you can look for opportunities to learn the process and the why things are being done in a certain way, you can often look for opportunities to streamline. It's not going to be revolutionary, and it depends where you are in the organization. If you're lower in the organization, you have 3 or 4 layers of hierarchy above you, it's going to be more challenging for you to push back on those particular things. In that case, identifying potentially other things you can work on concurrently, or how you can concurrently get ahead of things. I think foresight comes into play at that level, just knowing that it will take the time it takes to do your procurement, and you just got to plan it appropriately. That kind of thing works. If you're higher up in the organization, you're able to, I don't like the terms higher and lower, but you get my point.
Yeah.
If you're in a position of influence, I would say, you may be able to then start going corporately, like go have the conversation with, JP about digital funding models, or go have the conversation with your privacy and security officer about how we can improve the PIA process, or thing which they are doing. All those kind of things, I think, are opportunities you have.
I like your comment about, like, where, up and down, kind of where we are, because, I think the whole idea of, like, digital era leadership is, like, you're not always in a position of making decisions necessarily. So do you have any thoughts about how one kind of leads within an organization when you're not in a position of traditional leadership? Like, how do you do these things and provide influence when, you're still kind of growing in your career as a public servant?
Yeah, I think what jumps to mind for me is just that network, right? It's really understanding who and what you can influence. So again, leadership doesn't have anything to do with where you sit in the organization. It often has everything to do with who you can potentially influence or what you can potentially influence. So for me, again, it's nailing those, I can't say it enough, it's nailing those foundations, like know your finance, HR, and procurement pieces so that you can ask the right questions. But it's building those relationships and ensuring that you're challenging ideas up and down, you're being fair, you're being empathetic to the situations going on around you. If you're having a giant reorg, not a great time to challenge an assumption, right? If you're in the middle of, some sort of environmental emergency and your department is leading the response, not the time to say, I don't want to write that briefing note. So that situational awareness, I think, will help you lead regardless of where you sit in the organization. But I know you probably have a better answer to that, because that is your jam.
It's interesting because, like, I think when you start to exemplify some of these, like, competencies and traits of just being like like challenging things, but also kind of just being a good public servant and acting with the citizens in mind, then I think that's when you really start to lead in your roles. And just knowing that like what you're doing is going to impact someone at the end of the day, and like you're doing it for the right reasons. And coming back to like showing, not telling, I think can be really impactful for just making sure it's like, hey, like I'm trying to lead in this space. This is my space. This is my little sandbox to play in, and I've got some database decision making that I've made, and it's easy to make a good case. But yeah.
Well, you nailed it on the. I think government has a corner on meaningful work. Like I think the reason we can get really talented technologists is because we have this absolute volume of meaningful work. There's no better place that you can go. There's no other organization you can go and you can work in the social sector and advanced education and move over to the natural resource sector and go to justice, go all the way through those spaces and not leave the organization. Like it's a pretty unique experience to be able to do that.
Truly, and to be able to get so many opportunities or like chances to work on varying projects within one organization is like pretty amazing.
Amy, I have one more thing on that just popped up, is thinking about two opportunities where you can put your hand up. So some of the ways that you can lead too is not just looking inside your organization, but put your hand up for those cross-government opportunities, that working group that's doing the thing to establish the new policy or solving whatever problem. Put your hand up for some of those opportunities.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think, getting involved in like the various networks and community building events, hint, hint, wink, wink, I think really goes a long way, because then you start to see who's doing other cool things across government and where you might be able to kind of get involved and stuff. So, so I want to kind of switch gears just a little bit and talk a little bit about air cover. Because it's like the term itself is a little jargony, and so I kind of want to break it down because I think it's a really important point. So let's first start with like, how do you define air cover? What does that look like? And then like, how do you kind of get air cover?
Totally. So first off, I call it the poop umbrella as well. That's why there was an umbrella on the slide. So defining air cover for me is the ability for me or the team to operate towards whatever goal or objective we're trying to work towards without outside influence. And outside influence can be anything. It can be our executive actually doing it. It could be the privacy officer talking to me all the time. It could be being asked to speak in a bunch of places and my team just needs to focus and deliver. So I define it as like putting that poop umbrella out, if you will. And so I think it's the responsibility of our leadership to go like, I'm protecting my team and I'm filtering the things that they need to hear and not need to hear, because it can be overwhelming. Like we have all these different communities, we have all these different things. You could go spend all day doing market research. You got to be able to focus. So creating that focus. The actionable steps to actually build air cover is it all comes down to trust and that momentum piece. And I know I'm sounding a bit repetitive, but it's finding opportunities that you can show and validate to executive that they can delegate that authority down to you, that they trust you to operate without oversight. So this is a bit of an anti-micromanagement approach, full transparency. But again, if you're doing it with full transparency, they're actually getting more information, having more access to people and more understanding of what's going on. So little things like straight activity or type things is understand what your leadership needs to see and why. It's a fair question to ask. What do you need to see all the time? The other piece on the air cover side or building air cover is understanding who has influence in the organization. So I'm a big fan of stakeholder mapping, starting to look around and look at who has influence, who may actually have interest in this, and so on and so forth, and moving people along those matrices through those boxes to try and understand who actually has interest and impact or an influence in what I'm doing and how can they help me. So again, it's that network side of the house. If you establish it and you can build trust, people will give you space, but you have to keep delivering, because you'll lose it right away, right?
Do you think a lot of execs kind of understand why we ask them for air cover, or like, do you think that it's a concept that a lot of executives are familiar with, or is this kind of new and emerging, or like, what do you think about that?
No, I think it's a good point, and I think some do and some don't, and to de-jargon it, to your point, I would say you're not asking for quote air cover. What you're saying is, hey, director, ADM, whoever, I need you to help me by handling these 3 or 4 committees, or can you give the team and I 3 weeks to be able to deliver X? So it's starting to ask for specific things, and then over time you're kind of creating that sort of umbrella. This happens to all of us, right? You do something really well and everyone asks you to do it 1,000 times.
Always.
Right? Of course. That's the biggest challenge is you need someone, or you have to ask someone to go and put the umbrella up for you. So again, if you want to de-jargon it, it's saying, hey, ADM, I'm getting a ton of requests to do this thing. I know it's really important to the product, but it doesn't fit here. This is why. You can see why, or this thing that we're building doesn't fit into our team's backlog, if you will. I need you to help me and go have those conversations for me. So I think it's pointing executive to what they're doing. They might not necessarily recognize it as air cover if you just said that.
And being transparent, I think, about your needs and your team's needs and what capacity you have. Like, yeah, we want to do all the things, but at the end of the day, we're people and we can only do so many things. And I think it's really important to like communicate that in a way that it's like, would love to, but it's in the backlog or it's on our not doing list right now. Get to it when we can. So
yeah, and again, it comes down to those, like, have you been thoughtful about the way in which that you have structured your metrics and structured the objectives that you're trying to achieve so that you can communicate that the thing doesn't fit in. Great example is working with Bytes Digital Services. There were many, many times where we had this big, high-powered two-team, agile team running. They're ripping down. All looks good. Everyone wants a piece of something. We were clear. We had 3 goals every 4 months. And if it did not fit in those 3 goals, it did not get done. Our air cover was our ADM protecting those 3 goals. So you can make it really tangible for your executive to be able to say, nope, doesn't fit in. Sorry, nope, thank you. We'll record it, yes, and, but no.
Yeah. There's a really interesting comment that came through kind of related to that about things kind of coming in or like the next new shiny thing that we're trying to build. And how do we ensure that we're being deliberate about understanding the true business need or value for the user, maybe communicating that to our execs and just not going for that next new fancy tool that we want to get because it's fancy?
There's always a tension there. There's a tension between the fancy tool and then there's a tension between the priority of the leadership. Which may or may not be the same thing. The answer is you go straight to research, you get evidence, you go and you do foundational design and you understand the problem. And that is where having built that momentum and trust with your executive will really come into play. Because when you get to a place where they trust what you're doing, you can say that. You could say, I know that that's the thing that seems really cool, but what evidence do we have that that's going to solve this problem that we're trying to achieve or that we're hearing about? And I've many occasions thrown foundational research at that problem to say, I have no problem doing it, but I need some evidence that it's the thing that is the priority. And I would say, I'm probably batting 50%. 50% of the time, I'm like, oh, didn't know that was a thing. The other 50%, I'm like, told ya. So I think you got to throw that foundational design piece at it, and again, like go to the source, define the problem, do the research to understand the needs. I know we all get cornered at some point to just do something, but yeah, you can try your best.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it's like, oh, can we do something fun and new and innovative, or deal with our tech debt or our legacy stuff? It's like some people love it. Some of us are like, oh, what's the new shiny thing? Would rather do that.
Well, and I will say too, like there's so much of this is about that multidisciplinary team, which we haven't really talked about. But when you're creating that environment, sometimes giving the team space to go and do the shiny thing, it's okay. Like it's fine. Let them do it. But again, you got to prioritize some of those other pieces that might not be as important. But there's a team health element to that too, as you're starting to look, right?
Yeah. It's nice to balance out like the fun stuff with like the actual objectives that we have to deliver really well on, but also, space to learn and like develop as individuals and like pick up some skill sets that we can bring back into the team.
Well, great example is like we, as an organization, as environment and Bytes Digital Services, we've done hackathons,
right?
Multiple times, right? And we've managed to convince our executive that it's cool to pay for our vendors to go and spend 2 days doing cool, fun things that may or may not make it to production and may or may not add value. And I would say the most recent one we did in, this is back almost a year ago, May of 2021, we have 4 or 5 items that came out of that are in production that have saved hundreds of hours of time.
Amazing.
And totally just, on the side of, for those of you who know, the chef's forums, their natural resource common services, common hosted forums, hundreds of hours. So creating those opportunities for people to be excited and engaged and come in and learn, I think they're really quite important in this space because it exposes people that wouldn't have been exposed to that before.
And I think it starts to come back to this idea that we don't always know what the right solution is, and that sometimes we need to try it and test things and like
what do you mean?
Yeah, like this whole, fail fast and test things out, and like having the space to do that and giving the team space to do that, I think is really important. And like a good leader or like an effective leader will often, I think, give that space to try.
Yeah, and I think this goes to one of the points here that was quality, like prioritize quality. Mm-hmm. Quality is important, and to get quality, sometimes it takes a little bit of play, a little bit of space, a little bit of patience, a little bit of pushback. But you'll get quality if you create that environment where people want to deliver quality and they know that that's what you prioritize. If you just kind of, that rapid hit team growth kind of stuff, you're just you might churn stuff out, but it might not be that valuable.
Yeah. And then people get kind of bored and disengaged and the burnout happens and yeah.
Yeah, it's that sustainability end, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we've got some interesting comments around the networking piece. A couple questions. So the 2 parts. How can we remove the need for networking to be the main channel for change for lower level employees? Not everyone is open to it or has the time to network, or introvert versus extrovert, sometimes that can be a barrier. So how do we kind of navigate that, especially when you're growing in your career?
Yeah, it's a good point. So it doesn't have to necessarily be like networking as you think of it traditionally. It doesn't have to be like me cold calling you or me going to a mixer or a funding thing. Yeah. So you can expand the definition of network and look at opportunities for your supervisor inside your work to expose you to other areas. So within your sanctioned environment of work, put you on projects. Maybe you don't necessarily have to be at a round table to do that. You can be on a Teams call. You can be part of an asynchronous offline team. So looking for opportunities that fit your strengths, that allow you to gain new connections. I struggle, to be honest, with how do you take that away from the only way to influence change? I don't think it is the only way to influence change. There's a lot of very strong hierarchical paths to influence change where you can go through. The challenge being is that we are organized in hierarchies and our solutions are not hierarchical, nor are they often in one vein. Mm-hmm. So when I sit inside one branch, it is very challenging for me to solve a government-wide organizational problem without going and having a conversation or having some sort of connection, whether in person, face-to-face, asynchronous, offline, whatever. It's tough. Mm-hmm. So I think it's just a very powerful way to influence change. It's certainly not the only way. I don't have any great answers.
Yeah, well, and it's so true. And one of the other questions related to this is how do we hear about cross-government initiatives and how do we volunteer and contribute? And I think it's, you start looking out at what's happening across government, getting involved in other projects, volunteering. Exchange Lab has things, using things like Compass, Teams. So I think there's a really multi-mode approach that one has to take, and it's not necessarily going to be a one-size-fits-all. And then having the space to do it, is the other kind of piece, making sure you carve that out, or your leadership supports you in carving that out.
I was just going to say, and I think that's a good point, is that it doesn't necessarily have to be the only way that you influence change, but I think what you can do is ask your leadership to create that space for you so that it's not above and beyond. And I think too, ask your leadership. And if you don't have great leadership, ask your peers of your leadership or ask for a skip level. And that's okay. Those kind of things are all good. And I know it can be challenging, kind of navigating the introvert-extrovert frame. I'm clearly extroverted, so I'm unsure on a lot of the other sides. But it's, I can tell you there's a lot of incredibly talented, introverted people with great deep networks that have not put themselves in situations where they've been uncomfortable. They found other ways to integrate and build those relationships.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so true. And I think, that's one of the benefits of working in a large organization is you get to work with all sorts of people in all different styles, and it's like challenging us as individuals to adapt and change and shift and recognize that not every approach is going to fit or work for everybody.
Well, and as a leader, like that's our responsibility, is to make sure that those individuals, above or below, again, have the opportunities to succeed. Mm-hmm. The last piece on that is just communication inside. Like, it's hard to make a change or to shift or influence change if no one knows you want to. So you have to find a way to speak out about what you want to do, and whether that's like actually participating on a particular thing or any way of doing it. It doesn't have to be like a standing up and waving your hand. It can be something in like many other ways. It can be a private Teams message to your leader saying like, hey, I'm really interested in this thing. Do you know any ways that I can get involved in that? Mm-hmm. But it's hard for us to mind read.
Yep.
Right. So as much as you can find ways to signal that intent, I think you can work it without that really vast network.
I know we're getting close to the end, but there's one really good question here that I want to wrap up with. And it kind of relates to trust in leadership. And I've heard this great term, like find good leaders and follow them. And I think it's true. Like when you find a leader that you jive with, like it's great to kind of see them grow and excel in their career, and maybe you can have some opportunities to go with. But when executives change organizations, often that trust moves with them. So are there tools that we can use to mitigate the need for a complete trust rebuild exercise when that happens? Or how do we kind of navigate the shifts that come out of that?
It's a good question, and it's tough because you're right. Sometimes it's so situational with an individual that it makes it really hard to transfer that. A couple things that jump to mind based on sort of the last 4 or 5 years. I really think re-emphasizing the thing that you're doing and really doing strong reorientation to that new leader is incredibly important. Being really transparent about where are our strengths, where are we not so great, what have we done a really good job of, what role did your predecessor have, what is your strength, what are you good at, what role do you want to have? Mm-hmm. Like starting to do that kind of real deep understanding of where they fit. Because often what happens when you get that failed approach, like that, okay, now we have to rebuild everything, and they slowed everything down, and now we got to ramp back up, is that you haven't been clear about what you were good at or what they were good at. And that leader coming in is different than the person that left. And they might not want to lead in the same way. And so oftentimes you do have to redo that. I would say there's always going to be a trust rebuild process, because they're not just going to inherit the trust that you had with your previous leader. But what you can do is speed it up by doing that kind of reorientation. The other thing is, I would say, use the credibility if it's available. So if the person has moved somewhere and they're accessible still, use the credibility that you had with them as an in with your new leader. So set up a cross brief. Make sure that everyone understands the kind of what happened, where did you go, what did you do, why was that there? And then as you start to get challenges, see if you can retain that leader for a little bit to allow them to come back and support you a tiny bit. And I know everyone won't do this, or everyone can't do this because maybe they're outside the org. But yeah. Mm-hmm.
I know, I hit you with bombshell right at the end, but I think it's an important thing, and I really appreciate all the questions and comments that have come through. And if there's more, we can carry this conversation on offline. But
Definitely.
I want to thank you for your insights and really appreciate all the information that you shared with us today. Big thanks to our production crew as well for helping us pull this event together. So just want to remind everybody that we actually have a survey post-event, and so we'd love to get your feedback on how our first Bright Bytes went. We've got a couple things coming up that you're also involved in. So wanted to just highlight that we've got the Digital BC call coming up on April 5th. So we've got Ruben Carter and CJ Ritchie featured at that one. And we also have our next Bright Bytes session next month on April 14th with JP Fournier, who will be speaking about how to build a successful funding request. So make sure you hit Eventbrite or the Learning Hub to sign up. Lots of really cool stuff happening with the Exchange Lab. We encourage you to check us out online. Thanks again for joining, Jill. Really pleased to have you. And thanks to everyone else for joining in on the live stream. See you next time.